Today I'm making this easy bread machine recipe that's a little bit different. This is a banana yeasted bread or a banana sandwich bread, not to be confused with a banana quick bread. The bananas add to the moisture and just a little bit of sweetness, but you will not believe how soft and fluffy this bread turns out and how wonderful it is for sandwiches. So let's just get started on the recipe. This bread machine banana sandwich bread is so easy to throw together. There's only 7 ingredients. I'm going to make a 1.5 size loaf today, but I'll also leave the measurements for a 1-pound loaf and a 2-pound loaf in the printable recipe that'll be down in the description. And I'll also include the measurements in grams if you'd rather bake that way. So let's get started on our bread machine banana sandwich bread. I'm going to get started with 3/4 cup of warm milk. This should be lukewarm. This should be about 100 to 110 degrees, and that'll just help your yeast to activate without being too hot that it's going to kill it. So 3/4 cup of milk right into your bread machine loaf pan. I'm using my Zojireshi bread machine. I love this bread machine. It's nice and strong, has a good strong motor, has the double paddles, needs everything so well. I just used whole milk. I usually use whole milk, but you can also use skim milk, 2%, soy milk, or any of those kind of milk alternatives if you'd rather do that. Also, I also use buttermilk in this bread, so if you want to use buttermilk, this is a great loaf to use it in. Or if you're trying to be a little bit more economical, you can use water in this loaf too. I've done that too, and it turns out great. Okay, next we want 2 tablespoons of honey. So I'm going to put that honey just right on in there with the milk. This is just some organic honey that I got from the grocery store, so it's nothing special or fancy, but it's going to have a really good flavor with this banana bread. And next we want 2 tablespoons of melted butter. This is my really cool little Lodge melting pot. I just put it on the stovetop and I melt my butter in there. So I love this thing. It's so handy and I use it all the time. So 2 tablespoons melted butter right on in there with your milk and your honey. And next it's time for our banana. So you want about 1/2 cup of banana, which is about 1 medium banana, and you want it nice and ripe. That'll just make it easier to mash. It'll have a more banana flavor and it won't be bitter. So the riper the better, it'll be a little bit more sweet. Now this banana isn't going to give this bread an overpowering flavor at all. This banana is going to slightly sweeten it, and it's also going to moisten this bread. So it is a great addition. You wouldn't think to put banana in your sandwich bread, but this works. It's kind of like our oatmeal jelly bread that we made a couple weeks ago. That bread, you would never know that it has jelly in it, but it just sweetens it and it works great for your loaf of bread. And next we want our flour. So I'm going to use bread flour in this bread, but you can just as easily use all-purpose flour. I've done that too. I have my flour stored in 5-gallon buckets in my pantry, so I went ahead and measured it, but you're going to use 3 cups of flour. Now, like I said, I'm using my bread flour. The bread flour has a higher protein content, and you'll just get a little bit better rise out of your bread, but all-purpose is fine too. You can also add a tablespoon of vital wheat gluten to your all-purpose flour if you want to make it more like bread flour. It'll just help your rise, and you'll get a little bit different chew, but either kind of flour is just fine. I know that these days the bread flour is a little bit more expensive, so all-purpose works. Next we want some salt. I like this Redmond's Fine Ancient Sea Salt. This is what I've been using and I really like this salt. But you can use the pink Himalayan sea salt. You can use just white table salt too. Either one is fine. But I'm going to want 1.5 teaspoons of this salt. I'm going to measure it over a different bowl so that I don't over measure and over salt in my bread. So 1.5 teaspoons. You definitely don't want to measure it over your other ingredients because that would totally ruin all the other ingredients if you put too much salt in there. And next is our yeast. I'm going to use this Red Star Active Dry Yeast. I love this yeast. This is mainly what I use. I also use some instant yeast every once in a while, but I mainly use this. And I like to buy it in these 2-pound packages, store it in the freezer, and it's going to last forever. This is definitely the most economical way. of buying yeast. If you're used to buying yeast in those little packets, that gets really expensive. So I'm going to use 1.5 teaspoons of this yeast. Now you can also use instant yeast. You can use bread machine yeast, rapid rise, whatever you want. Use 1.5 teaspoons, whatever kind of yeast you have. Now you'll notice I put it right on top of my salt, and that is totally fine. A lot of things say don't let your salt and your yeast interact or touch, but I'm going to throw this right into the bread machine right now and let everything get mixed up and incorporated, and so it's not going to matter at all. If you're going to use a delay timer, or it's going to take a while for your bread machine to get moving, then I would put my yeast away from the salt. But this works just fine if you're going to get it going right now. And those are all of the ingredients for our bread machine banana sandwich bread. So I'm going to throw this in the bread machine and get it going. This is my Zojirushi bread machine. I have the Supreme and I love this model. Oh, you can see how dirty my bread machine is. That's okay. This thing gets used and abused and it is going strong. I make bread so often in this bread machine. I love it. Okay, so I'm going to snap this into my bread machine and come over here. Now, if you want to make this entirely in your bread machine, you would just choose a basic white cycle. Light or medium crust is what I recommend for this loaf of bread, but I am going to choose the dough cycle. I love to use the dough cycle and then bake my bread in the oven. That's just what I prefer to do, and I do that about 90% of the time, so that's what I'm going to do with this loaf. So I'm going to choose the dough cycle. It's 1.5 hours. I'm going to press start, and it gets moving. Now, this is going to mix up this dough, knead it, let it rise, and then the dough cycle will be over and I can get it out, punch it down, shape it into a loaf, and bake it in the oven after it rises one more time. So in just a couple minutes, I'm going to check on this ball of dough. This is what I always say is the most important part of using your bread machine. If your dough is too dry or too wet, your loaf of bread is not going to turn out well. So I'm going to check this in just a few minutes and I will show you what it looks like. My dough has been kneading for about 8 minutes, and this is what it's looking like. Now it's looking pretty good. There's no ingredients stuck to the sides of the bowl, which is good. If there is, then take a rubber spatula and kind of work them all away from the sides of the bowl so that it can get incorporated into your ball of dough. But let's see. It's feeling good. It's tacky but not sticky, but you see how it's kind of a rough looking ball of dough? To me, that's looking a little dry, and I don't want my ball of dough to be dry. So I'm going to add about a tablespoon more of milk and then give it a few more minutes to mix up really well, and then I'll look at it again. So I'm just going to add just a little bit of milk right here to the bottom. And your ball of dough is going to look all wet and kind of funny for a few minutes, but you just need to give it a few minutes for it to mix up and it'll all incorporate in there. And I want my ball of dough to be smooth and shiny and not all like this. It looks a little rough, right? That's how you know it's a little bit dry. So if it's a little dry, then just add a little bit more milk. Give it a few minutes to mix up. If it needs some more, then add some more. I'm checking on my ball of dough for the second time. Oh, it's looking so much better. You see how much smoother it looks? It doesn't look nearly as dry. So that little bit of milk helped a lot. So that's why it's so important after you start your bread machine to not just walk away from it. It's really important to come and check on it about 5 or 10 minutes after you start your bread machine. It's been 1.5 hours and my yeasted banana sandwich bread dough has risen. The dough cycle is over and now it's time just to turn it out from the loaf pan. You can see my paddles stayed in, so make sure your paddles stay in or you get them out of your dough. Okay, now I'm going to just press out my dough just like this. Give it a good press out. And now it's time to shape it into a loaf and stick it in the loaf pan. So I'm just going to start from the top and I'm going to roll down. And you want to roll it nice and tight so that you have really good surface tension and you'll just get a really pretty loaf of bread that way. Now just tuck in the sides, kind of pinch your seams on the sides and on the bottom so that your bread doesn't burst while it's baking. And you'll see a little bit of these dark specks in the dough, and that is just from the banana. Okay, so that looks good. So I always try to make it about as long as my bread loaf pan. So this is my cast iron bread loaf pan. You can see inside it's all shiny. That's because I oiled it up really well. I usually pour maybe a half a tablespoon to a tablespoon of either olive oil or coconut oil into my cast iron loaf pans, and then I just rub it all around with a paper towel or brush it. This is an 8.5 by a 4.5 size loaf pan, so it's about a 1 pound loaf pan. This is a 1.5 pound loaf, but this will fit in there just fine. So I'm just gonna go ahead and plop this into my loaf. Now, I'm gonna let this rise. I'm gonna cover it with some saran wrap, and I'm gonna let it rise for, it'll probably take about 30 minutes. And I just want it to peek over the edge of the loaf pan. So while it's rising, I'm gonna go ahead and get my oven preheated to 350 degrees, and I will show this to you when it's ready to go in the oven. It has been 27 minutes and my dough has been rising, and it is ready to go into the oven to bake. This is what you want yours to look like when it's time to bake it. You just want it to be peeking up over the edge of the bread loaf pan, because when you bake it, it's still gonna rise a bit more. So this looks great. I had covered it up with some plastic wrap just so it wouldn't dry out. So now I'm gonna put it in the oven. The oven is preheated to 350 degrees, and I'm gonna let it bake for 30 minutes. Our yeasted banana bread or banana sandwich bread is fresh out of the oven. It baked at 350 degrees for 30 minutes. And isn't it beautiful? What a pretty golden color. Now I'm gonna turn it out of the loaf pan. Loaf pan is really hot, so I don't want to touch it. There we go. Slid out nicely because we oiled the cast iron really well. Oh my goodness, look at this beautiful loaf of bread. It's really hot, but it's so soft. Oh, what a nice loaf. Okay, this is what I like to do from here. I like to take my little melting pot, and I have some melted butter in here, and I like to just brush some nice melted butter all over the loaf. This gives you a really nice soft crust, that nice buttery flavor, the pretty shine. So I like doing this. So just take a second, brush it all over the loaf. And then you can use a cooling rack if you want, but what I like to do is take a tea towel and cover up the loaf of bread completely, and this lets that condensation and the warmth just give you a nice soft crust. This is how I like to cool my bread. So I'll let it cool just for a few minutes. If you let your bread cool, you'll get a better crumb and texture out of your bread. But I usually don't let it cool too long, but if you let it cool just for a little bit, it will help the texture. So I'm gonna let it cool just for a few minutes, and then I'm gonna cut into this loaf and have a little taste. Okay, let's cut into this bread. Isn't it so pretty? This is one of the reasons why I like using the dough cycle and baking my bread in the oven as opposed to the bread machine, because you just get a really pretty traditional looking loaf, and there's no holes on the bottom, so that's kind of nice too. Okay, this bread looks so good. It's time to cut into it so we can check it out. Oh, look at that. Looks really good. It is so soft. Oh, what a nice sandwich bread. Look at that. Doesn't that look so nice? It's soft, it's flexible, it's fluffy. Oh, beautiful loaf of bread right here. Okay, I'm gonna take a little bite. I like the heel, so I'm gonna take a little bite of this. So good. You can taste the banana a little bit, but if I hadn't baked this bread myself, I probably would have no idea that it was a banana flavor. But this bread would be fantastic with peanut butter and jelly, peanut butter and banana, French toast, anything kind of sweet, maybe just some butter and jam. Oh, fantastic bread. I love it. Let me just show you how I'm going to store my bread today. In an effort to use less plastic, I've started using these beeswax bread bags. And my daughters and I actually hand make these together. And they're available on my website, robinonthefarm.com. These are naturally breathable and antibacterial, so it helps keep your bread from molding. So these are pretty neat bread bags. They're 11 by 17, so they're large. You can fit a couple loaves of bread in here. And they're breathable, and they are just so nice for keeping your bread fresh. Now, they work best for crusty breads like sourdoughs and baguettes, but they also work really well if you're in a humid to normal climate. They're not quite as good at keeping your bread soft when you live in a dry or really cold climate. But these are fantastic. These will be on my website, and I'll also have a link down in the description for the recipe for this banana sandwich bread that you can print off. So thank you so much for being here with me on Robin on the Farm. I will see you next time.
Robin's in the kitchen, dough beneath her hands, wheat from the fields and eggs from her land. Sunlight through the window, a warm golden glow. She's working hard to make that dough.